The Rouge River had been rising for 2 days. On the evening of April 7, 1947, floodwaters swept through Dearborn, Michigan, toppling telephone poles and swallowing the banks where Henry Ford had once watched herons hunt for fish. The river that powered his estate now turned against it. Somewhere beneath the swollen current, the turbines of his private hydroelectric plant fell silent. The lights went out. Inside the 56-room mansion called Fair Lane, servants lit candles and kerosene lamps. Firelight flickered against limestone walls. The man who had put America on wheels, who had helped electrify a nation, now lay in a bedroom illuminated only by flame. He was 83 years old. Henry Ford had built Fair Lane to be self-sufficient. Its powerhouse generated enough electricity to supply not just the estate, but part of the surrounding town. For over 30 years, the system had never failed. Now, on the night he needed it most, the river he had harnessed refused to obey. Clara Ford, his wife of 59 years, sat beside him. The telephone lines were down. When Henry complained of feeling unwell, she sent the chauffeur into the storm to find a doctor. By the time help arrived, it was too late. The man who had transformed the 20th century died in conditions that would have been familiar to his parents in 1863. No electricity, no modern machinery, just candlelight and the sound of water rushing past in the darkness. This is the story of that house, how it came to be built, what it meant to the man who created it, and why, in the end, even the river could not save him. If you find value in my channel, please consider subscribing to the channel. Chapter 1. The Believer. Clara Bryant was not the kind of woman who waited for life to happen. Born on April 11, 1866, in Wayne County, Michigan, she grew up on a farm where practicality mattered more than poetry. As the eldest daughter in a family of 10 children, she learned to cook and clean before she learned to dream. But dream she did. At social gatherings common to rural farming communities, dances held at inns and taverns, Clara watched and listened and formed her own opinions about the young men who asked her to waltz. She met Henry Ford at one of these dances in 1885. She was 19 years old. He was 22, a thin young man with intense eyes who talked about machines the way other men talked about horses. Where others saw an oddity, Clara saw a possibility. Henry had grown up on a farm in nearby Springwells Township, but he had never loved the work the way his father expected. While other boys competed to see who could plow the straightest furrow, Henry dismantled watches to understand their mechanisms. At 16, he left home to find work in Detroit, apprenticing at machine shops and learning everything he could about engines and mechanics. By the time he met Clara, he had already repaired Westinghouse steam engines across southern Michigan. He spoke of building a horseless carriage, a vehicle that would run on gasoline and change how people traveled. Most young women in 1885 would have dismissed such talk as fantasy. Clara did not. They were engaged in 1886 and married 2 years later on April 11, 1888, Clara's 22nd birthday. The ceremony took place at her parents' home. For their first residence, Henry used lumber he cut and milled himself from family farmland to construct a small house Clara had designed. They called it the Square House, though some knew it as the honeymoon house. It would be the second of 15 homes the couple would occupy during their marriage. Henry's father had given them farmland as a wedding gift, and for 3 years the young couple lived the life expected of them. But Henry spent his evenings in a small workshop, tinkering with engines rather than tending crops. Clara brought him meals while he worked. She held lanterns so he could see. When neighbors whispered that her husband was wasting his time on foolish contraptions, she said nothing to discourage him. In September 1891, the Fords made a decision that would alter everything. They left the farm and moved to Detroit, where Henry had accepted a position as an engineer at the Edison Illuminating Company. Clara packed up their belongings and followed him into an uncertain future, trading the security of farmland for a series of rented rooms in a growing industrial city. The work at Edison suited Henry. Within 2 years, he had risen to chief engineer, a position that gave him both steady income and flexible hours. More importantly, it gave him time to pursue his obsession. In a brick shed behind their rented house on Bagley Avenue, Henry assembled his first gasoline engine. Clara was there on Christmas Eve, 1893, when he finished it. She dripped gasoline into the intake while Henry spun the flywheel. The engine coughed, sputtered, and roared to life in their kitchen, filling the room with noise and fumes. It was not the kind of Christmas gift most wives would appreciate. Clara called it wonderful. Their son Edsel had been born just weeks earlier, on November 6th. Clara now had an infant to care for and a husband who disappeared into his workshop every night. She never complained. When colleagues at Edison questioned whether Henry's automobile experiments would ever amount to anything, Clara remained steadfast. Henry later gave her a title that would follow her through history. He called her the Believer. By 1896, Henry had constructed his first complete vehicle, a contraption he named the quadricycle. 4 bicycle wheels, a buggy frame, a small gasoline engine. It was crude and unreliable, and shook violently at any speed above walking pace, but it moved under its own power. Clara watched from the doorway as her husband drove it through the pre-dawn streets of Detroit, testing what years of late nights and borrowed tools had created. She had believed in him when no one else did. She would continue believing for the next 50 years, through failures and fortunes, through fame that neither of them anticipated. The woman who had learned to be practical on a Michigan farm would stand beside Henry Ford as he built an empire, raised a family, and eventually constructed a house on the Rouge River that was meant to last forever. But that house was still 2 decades away. First, Henry Ford had to change the world. Chapter 2: The Car That Changed America. The quadricycle that Henry Ford drove through Detroit in June 1896 weighed about 500 pounds. It had no reverse gear. The steering mechanism was a simple tiller, like something from a boat. When Ford wanted to show it to potential investors, he had to drive around the block because he could not back up. It was, by any reasonable measure, a primitive machine, but Henry Ford saw in it something more than nuts and bolts. He saw the future. The problem was convincing anyone else. Ford spent the next several years chasing that future while it slipped repeatedly through his fingers. In 1899, a group of Detroit businessmen formed the Detroit Automobile Company around Ford's designs. The venture collapsed within 2 years. Investors wanted cars they could sell immediately. Ford wanted to keep refining, improving, perfecting. He refused to release a vehicle until he considered it ready. The businessmen ran out of patience. A second attempt followed in 1901. The Henry Ford Company lasted even less time. Ford clashed with his financial backers over the direction of the enterprise. When they brought in an outside consultant to evaluate his work, Ford walked away entirely. The company he abandoned reorganized itself around that consultant's ideas and eventually became Cadillac. 2 failures in 3 years. Most men would have reconsidered their path. Ford built a racing car instead. He called it the 999, after a famous locomotive. The machine was dangerous, loud, and spectacularly fast. Ford himself refused to race it at high speeds, so he recruited a bicycle racer named Barney Oldfield to drive. Oldfield had never operated an automobile before. Within days, he mastered the machine. At Grosse Pointe in October 1902, the 999 defeated Alexander Winton, the most successful racing driver in America at the time. The victory made headlines across the country. Henry Ford suddenly had something more valuable than money. He had a reputation. On June 16, 1903, Ford and 12 investors incorporated the Ford Motor Company with $28,000 in cash. Ford owned 25.5% of the new enterprise. He was not yet the dominant figure he would become, but he had learned from his previous failures. This time, he would balance his perfectionism with the practical demands of commerce. The company sold its first car on July 15, 1903. Over the next 5 years, Ford and his engineers produced a succession of models, each identified by a letter of the alphabet. Model A, Model B, Model C. Some succeeded modestly, others failed. The Model N, priced at $600, proved that Americans would buy automobiles if the price was right. Ford absorbed this lesson and began planning something more ambitious. In October 1908, the Ford Motor Company introduced the Model T. Everything Ford had learned about manufacturing, about pricing, about what ordinary Americans actually needed, came together in this single vehicle. The Model T was not elegant. It was not fast. The suspension rattled over rough roads, and the hand crank could break an arm if it kicked back. But it was simple enough that farmers could repair it themselves, tough enough to handle the rutted dirt paths that passed for roads in rural America, and cheap enough that working families could imagine owning one. Within months of its release, demand exceeded anything Ford could produce. Here was the problem Ford had always understood but never fully solved. Building excellent cars meant nothing if he could not build enough of them. Each vehicle assembled by hand required skilled craftsmen working at their own pace. Production bottlenecks appeared everywhere. Customers waited months for delivery. Ford needed a revolution in manufacturing to match his revolution in design. He found it in an unlikely place. Chicago meatpacking plants used overhead conveyors to move animal carcasses past workers, each of whom performed a single task before the carcass moved on. It was a disassembly line. Ford's engineers realized the principle could work in reverse. In 1910, Ford opened a new factory in Highland Park, Michigan. The building itself was revolutionary. Designed by architect Albert Kahn, the plant featured massive windows that flooded work areas with natural light and open floor plans that could be reconfigured as production methods evolved. Ford called it the Crystal Palace. Inside those walls, his engineers began experimenting. In April 1913, they tried moving a magneto flywheel assembly down a line of workers, each man adding one component before pushing the flywheel to the next station. Production time dropped from 20 minutes to 13. Further refinements cut it to 5. By the end of 1913, Ford had applied the moving assembly line to the entire chassis. Workers no longer walked to their tasks. The tasks came to them on a continuous chain that never stopped moving. A complete Model T now emerged from the factory every 93 minutes. Under the old stationary methods, the same car had required over 12 hours. The price of the Model T fell accordingly. $850 at launch, $550 by 1913. By the time production ended in 1927, customers could purchase a new Model T for as little as $260. Ford had made the automobile affordable to the very workers who built it. Between 1908 and 1927, Ford Motor Company produced over 15 million Model T automobiles. For nearly 2 decades, no competitor came close. The car transformed American geography, American commerce, American courtship, American everything. Families who had never traveled more than 20 miles from their birthplace now drove across states. Farmers delivered goods to distant markets. Young couples escaped the watchful eyes of parents and chaperones. Henry Ford did not merely build cars, he built the 20th century. But the assembly line that made this possible came with costs that Ford had not anticipated. The relentless pace, the monotony, the transformation of skilled craftsmen into interchangeable parts of a human machine. Workers began leaving as fast as Ford could hire them. The solution he devised would shock the nation. Chapter 3: The $5 Revolution. On January 5, 1914, Henry Ford and his vice president James Couzens made an announcement that turned Ford from a successful industrialist into a national phenomenon. The company would pay its workers $5 a day. Factory workers across America earned between $2 and $3 for a full day's labor. Ford's own employees had been making $2.34 for 9 hours of work. Now the company proposed to more than double their wages while reducing their shift to 8 hours. Newspapers called it madness. The Wall Street Journal declared it a crime against the natural order of business. Rival industrialists accused Ford of undermining the wage structure that kept American factories profitable. Ford had his reasons, and they were not sentimental. The assembly line had created a crisis. The work was monotonous, exhausting, and dehumanizing. Men stood in one place for hours, performing the same motion thousands of times while the chain pulled an endless parade of half-built cars past their station. Many lasted only weeks before walking out. By late 1913, annual turnover exceeded 380%. The company was hiring thousands of workers each month just to replace those who quit. Each departure meant lost productivity. Each new hire required training. The costs of constant turnover threatened to consume the profits that mass production generated. $5 a day solved the problem instantly. When Ford opened his employment office the morning after the announcement, 10,000 men stood waiting in the January cold. By the following day, the crowd had swelled to 15,000. Fistfights broke out. Police used fire hoses to disperse the mob. Ford responded by announcing the company would only hire workers who had lived in Detroit for at least 6 months. Inside the factory, everything changed. Turnover plummeted. Productivity soared. Workers who had once watched the clock now competed for the privilege of staying. But there was a catch. The $5 wage was not a straight salary. Workers still received their base pay of $2.34. The additional $2.66 came as a profit-sharing bonus, and not everyone qualified. Single men under 22 received only the base rate. So did women, regardless of age or circumstance. Female workers would not become eligible until October 1916, after pressure from women's groups forced a change in policy, and all workers had to prove they deserved the bonus by submitting to investigation by Ford's newly created sociological department. Inspectors visited workers' homes without warning. They examined bank accounts, interviewed neighbors, checked for signs of drinking or gambling or domestic trouble. They required employees to keep their houses clean, their families intact, their habits respectable. Immigrant workers had to attend company classes in English and American customs. Those who failed to meet the standards received 6 months to improve. Those who still fell short after 6 months were fired. Ford saw no contradiction. He believed he was improving lives, teaching men to become better workers by becoming better citizens. His employees saw it differently. Many resented the intrusion into their private affairs but endured it for the money. The sociological department would fade by 1921, its methods too invasive even for that era of corporate paternalism. What remained was the revolution itself. Ford had demonstrated that high wages could be good business. He had proven that workers with money in their pockets became customers who bought the products they made. Within 2 years, company profits doubled to $60 million. And Henry Ford had made himself the most famous industrialist on Earth. Chapter 4. Escape to Dearborn. The house on Edison Avenue had been everything Henry and Clara Ford wanted when they built it in 1908. 7,000 square feet of Italian Renaissance elegance in Detroit's most prestigious neighborhood. A workshop above the garage where young Edsel could tinker with engines. Gardens designed by the finest landscape architect in the city. For 7 years, it was home. Then came the $5 day. Within hours of the announcement, the quiet street became impassable. Job seekers lined the sidewalk outside their door. Strangers appeared on their front porch at all hours, begging for work or demanding to speak with Henry. The Fords could not leave their own house without being surrounded. Fame had made their life unbearable. Clara had endured much in her years with Henry. The ridicule when he insisted he could build a horseless carriage. The financial uncertainty of failed ventures. The long nights when he disappeared into his workshop and forgot to come home for dinner. But this invasion of their privacy was something neither of them could accept. They began looking for land outside the city. Henry knew exactly where he wanted to go. 2 miles from his birthplace, along a stretch of the Rouge River that he had known since childhood, lay farmland that still looked much as it had when his father first cleared it. Between 1908 and 1910, Ford quietly purchased more than 1,300 acres of woods and meadows and working farms. The land included property that had once belonged to families his parents had known. It felt less like buying real estate than reclaiming a birthright. Clara had her own reasons for choosing Dearborn over the lakeside estates that other wealthy Detroiters preferred. She had grown up on a farm not far from Henry's family. The Rouge River Valley was home in a way that Lake St. Clair could never be. In the summer of 1912, While their architects began drawing plans, Henry and Clara sailed for Europe. Ford wanted to visit his factories in England, but he also wanted to see Ireland. His father, William, had been born in Ballinascarthy, a village in County Cork, and had fled the famine in 1847. His mother, Mary, had been orphaned as a child and adopted by a Cork family named Ahern. Henry had grown up hearing stories of the old country, but he had never seen it for himself. In Cork City, Ford met with a priest at the North Cathedral who helped him search the parish records. There he found the baptismal entry for Patrick Ahern, the man who had raised his mother. Ahern had been born in 1804 on a narrow street called Fair Lane. Ford also traveled to Ballinascarthy, where he photographed the one-room stone cottage his grandfather had left behind. He wanted to buy the entire structure and ship it to America, but the price was too high. Instead, Ford purchased the original hearthstones from the fireplace. He would build them into the walls of his new home. When that home was finally completed in 1915, Henry and Clara gave it the name that connected them to both their families and to the country their ancestors had fled. They called it Fair Lane. Chapter 5. The Woman Who Designed It. Henry Ford wanted the most famous architect in America to design his new home. In 1909, he approached Frank Lloyd Wright. Wright was at the height of his influence. His prairie-style houses had transformed American domestic architecture, replacing Victorian clutter with clean horizontal lines that seemed to grow from the landscape itself. A Ford commission would have been the largest residential project of his career. But Wright never built Fair Lane. In September of that year, he abandoned his wife, his 6 children, and his Oak Park studio to flee to Europe with the wife of one of his clients. The scandal made headlines across the country. Wright's practice collapsed overnight. The commission passed to Herman von Holst, an architect who had agreed to complete Wright's abandoned projects. Von Holst was competent, but he knew his limitations. He lacked the instinct for prairie style that Wright's clients expected, so he sought out the person who understood Wright's design philosophy better than anyone else alive. Her name was Marion Mahoney. In 1909, there were almost no female architects in America. Mahoney had been the first woman licensed to practice architecture in Illinois, earning her credentials in 1898. She had been Wright's first employee, hired in 1895, and for 14 years she had been his secret weapon. The beautiful watercolor renderings that introduced Wright's buildings to the world, the drawings that made prairie style famous, were largely her work. Wright never credited her publicly. He rarely credited anyone. When von Holst offered her the Ford project, Mahoney accepted on one condition. She would have complete control of the design. By this time, Mahoney had married Walter Burley Griffin, a fellow architect who had also worked in Wright's studio. Together, they would go on to design the capital city of Australia. But in 1912 and 13, Mahoney focused her attention on the Ford estate. She developed plans for a prairie-style home on the banks of the Rouge River. Low roof lines stretching toward the horizon, bands of windows that dissolved the boundary between interior and landscape, a house that would emerge from the Michigan countryside as naturally as the trees that surrounded it. In February 1914, she submitted her final rendering to Clara Ford. The Fords rejected it. The reasons remain unclear. Some accounts cite disputes over contractors and suppliers. Others suggest that Clara, after visiting English manor houses during trips to Britain, wanted something more traditional. Whatever the cause, the relationship ended badly. Mahoney was dismissed, and her vision for Fair Lane was never built. Clara found the replacement architect herself during a shopping trip to New York. His name was William Van Tyne, and he was an interior designer from Pittsburgh with no significant architectural credentials. The Fords were cautious enough to hire a detective agency to investigate his background. The report came back unflattering. Van Tyne had trouble paying his bills. They hired him anyway. Van Tyne took Mahoney's plans and transformed them. He kept the low profile and integrated landscape of the prairie style, but added medieval touches that Clara admired. A round, castellated tower on the riverside, stepped parapets and Gothic details. The American Institute of Architects would later call the result a prairie Gothic villa. Others described it as Scottish baronial modified by Midwestern sensibilities. Construction had begun in February 1914 with the original contractors. When Van Tine took over, he brought his own crew and his own ideas. The house rose slowly through that year and the next. 31,000 square feet of Indiana limestone, 56 rooms arranged across 2 stories, walls between 18 and 24 inches thick, 8 fireplaces, 15 bathrooms, an indoor swimming pool, and a bowling alley in the basement. The total cost exceeded $1 million. Marion Mahoney Griffin never spoke publicly about losing the Ford commission. By the time Fair Lane was completed in December 1915, she and her husband had already moved on to larger things. Their winning design for Canberra had made them internationally famous. They would spend the next 2 decades in Australia, far from the Midwestern prairies where their careers had begun. The house that Henry and Clara Ford finally occupied bore little resemblance to what Mahoney had imagined. But traces of her influence remained in the low profile, the integration with the riverbank, the way the building seemed to belong to its setting rather than dominate it. Fair Lane was not the prairie masterpiece she had envisioned. It was something stranger and more complicated, like the man who built it. Chapter 6: The House That Powered Itself. In November 1915, Henry and Clara Ford finally moved into Fair Lane. After nearly 2 years of construction, architectural disputes, and a parade of contractors, the house was ready. But the building they occupied was more than a home. It was a machine. To understand Fair Lane, you have to understand the friendship that shaped it. In August 1896, a young Henry Ford attended a convention of the Association of Edison Illuminating Companies in Brooklyn, New York. Ford was 33 years old, an unknown engineer working for Edison's Detroit subsidiary. Thomas Edison was 49, the most famous inventor in the world. During a banquet at the Oriental Hotel, someone mentioned to Edison that one of the junior engineers had been building a gasoline-powered carriage. Edison asked to meet him. Ford sketched his design on a menu card and explained how it worked. When he finished, Edison brought his fist down on the table. "Young man, that's the thing. You have it. Keep at it." Ford would later say that Edison's bang on the table was worth worlds to him. No one had ever given him such encouragement. The 2 men forged a friendship that would last 35 years, until Edison's death in 1931. When Ford began planning Fair Lane, he asked his old mentor to help design the heart of the estate. Not the house itself, but the powerhouse that would make it run. Edison created a hydroelectric generating system unlike anything built for a private residence. Workers constructed a dam across the Rouge River, diverting water into a 4-story limestone building that matched the mansion in material and craftsmanship. Inside, 2 massive turbines spun continuously, driven by the current of the river. The generators they powered produced 110 kilowatts of electricity, enough to light the entire estate and still feed surplus power back into Dearborn's municipal grid. The powerhouse was more than a utility building. The ground floor contained a 12-car garage equipped with an automotive turntable, allowing Ford to store and retrieve vehicles without the awkwardness of backing out. Above the garage, Ford built a private laboratory where he worked on experimental engine designs. He installed a security gate on the stairs and allowed only his most trusted associates to enter. That room remained locked to visitors for decades. Thomas Edison himself laid the cornerstone. A bronze plaque still marks the spot, dedicating the building to the man whose encouragement had started Ford on his path. A 300-foot underground tunnel connected the powerhouse to the main residence. The passageway ran beneath the gardens, its arched stone walls giving it the appearance of a medieval crypt. Service staff used the tunnel to move between buildings without disturbing the grounds above. Doors along its length led to the bowling alley, the swimming pool, and various utility rooms that kept the estate functioning. Ford had designed Fair Lane to need nothing from the outside world. The hydroelectric plant generated power. The greenhouses grew vegetables and flowers year-round. The working farm produced meat and dairy. He wanted complete independence, a kingdom unto itself. This obsession with self-sufficiency reflected something deep in Ford's character. He had grown up on a farm where families provided for themselves or went without. He had watched his mother die when he was 12, watched his father struggle to keep the household running. The memory never left him. Fair Lane would never depend on anyone. The powerhouse still operates today. More than a century after Edison designed it, the original turbines continue to spin, generating electricity from the same river that powered Henry Ford's dreams. The tunnel still connects the buildings. The laboratory upstairs remains much as Ford left it. Clara preferred the sunlit rooms of the main house, the gardens she had helped design, the music room where she hosted dances and recitals. Henry spent his happiest hours in the powerhouse, surrounded by machinery and the sound of rushing water. The estate had been built for both of them, but it was the powerhouse that revealed who Henry Ford truly was. A man who trusted machines more than people. A man who believed that with enough engineering, he could make himself independent of the world. Chapter 7. Jensen's Gardens. The man who would transform Fair Lane from farmland into a work of art arrived in America with nothing but a love of the land. Jensen was born in Denmark in 1860 and trained at the Thun Agricultural School near Copenhagen. He immigrated to the United States in 1884, speaking no English, and took a job as a laborer for Chicago's West Park Commission. Within 4 years, he had created something revolutionary. The American garden in Union Park looked nothing like the formal European landscapes that dominated Gilded Age cities. Jensen had traveled into the surrounding prairie, dug up native wildflowers, and transplanted them into a corner of the park. Where other designers imported exotic plants from distant continents, Jensen used the flora that had grown in the Midwest for thousands of years. The idea seems obvious now. In 1888, it was radical. Over the next 2 decades, Jensen rose through the Chicago park system, becoming general superintendent by 1905. He collaborated with Frank Lloyd Wright and Louis Sullivan. He developed a philosophy that matched their prairie-style architecture with a prairie-style approach to landscape. Native plants, horizontal lines, spaces that felt like they had always existed, as if human hands had merely revealed what nature intended. When the architects at Von Holst and Fife began designing Fair Lane, they recommended Jensen for the grounds. Henry Ford agreed immediately. Here was a man who shared his instincts. Ford had grown up watching the Michigan prairies disappear under farms and factories. Jensen offered a way to bring them back. Jensen worked at Fair Lane from 1914 to 1920, transforming worn-out farmland into something that felt wild and ancient. He planted native oaks and hawthorns. He carved meadows through the woods and let prairie grasses reclaim the open spaces. He created wandering paths that led nowhere in particular, designed for contemplation rather than efficiency. His masterpiece was the entrance drive. Instead of proceeding straight to the house, visitors found themselves winding through dense woodland. Large trees planted on the inside of each curve blocked any long view. The forest seemed to go on forever. Then, without warning, the drive emerged into open space, and the house appeared in full view ahead. Jensen called this the delayed view. He wanted the experience of arrival to feel like discovery. For Henry Ford, Jensen designed 2 long meadows aligned with the solstices. On the summer solstice, the setting sun would glow through a precise gap in the trees at the meadow's western end, bathing the entire landscape in golden light. On the winter solstice, the same effect occurred along a different axis. Ford, who loved precision and engineering, was delighted. Nature itself had become a kind of machine. Jensen also knew that Ford was passionate about birds. He selected plants specifically for their food and nesting potential. He placed 500 birdhouses throughout the property. Ford even imported 500 English songbirds to release in his sanctuary, hoping to establish new species in Michigan. The boathouse that Jensen designed featured artificial cliffs built from native stone, creating the illusion that the river had carved its own path through rock. Stepping stones crossed the top of the dam so that Clara could walk to visit her sister on the opposite bank. Every detail served both function and beauty. But Clara Ford had her own ideas about gardens. She loved roses. She loved formal layouts and geometric patterns, and the careful cultivation that Jensen despised. In the mid-1920s, she commissioned Rosarian Harriet Foote and landscape architect Herbert Kellaway to create something Jensen had specifically advised against: a formal rose garden covering more than 2 acres carved into the meadow that Jensen had so carefully restored. When Clara's garden was completed in 1926, it contained 10,000 roses in 400 varieties. There were pergolas and summer houses, and stone bridges over ornamental ponds. The cost exceeded $200,000. Jensen resigned in disgust. The rose garden represented everything he had spent his career opposing: imported plants, geometric beds, the imposition of human will onto land that should have been allowed to remain wild. He could not stop Clara Ford from building it, but he refused to watch. Today, the rose garden lies in ruins, its pergolas collapsed, its beds overgrown. Jensen's meadows and woodlands remain. Chapter 8: The Vagabonds. Every summer, America's 3 richest men packed up their cars and disappeared into the wilderness. They called themselves the Vagabonds. The group began by accident. In 1914, Henry Ford and naturalist John Burroughs drove to Florida to visit Thomas Edison at his winter home in Fort Myers. The 3 men toured the Everglades together, bouncing along rutted roads, and discovered they shared something beyond professional respect. They all loved the outdoors. They all craved escape from the relentless demands of fame and fortune. The following year, Ford, Edison, and tire magnate Harvey Firestone found themselves together at the Panama Pacific Exposition in San Francisco. After the fair, they drove south to San Diego, stopping to visit the plant breeder Luther Burbank along the way. By the time they reached the coast, they had hatched a plan. Every summer from now on, they would take to the road together. No schedule, no obligations, just 4 men exploring America. John Burroughs joined the group in 1916, and the 4 vagabonds were complete. Burroughs was the oldest and least famous of the 4, but in some ways he was the most important. At 79, he was America's most beloved nature writer. His essays had introduced millions of readers to the pleasures of birdwatching and woodland walks. Theodore Roosevelt had camped with him in Yellowstone. He lived in a hand-built cabin called Slabsides in the Catskill Mountains, where visitors from Oscar Wilde to John Muir had come to sit by his fire. Ford and Burroughs had met in 1913, and the friendship changed Ford's life. The 2 men shared a passion for birds that bordered on obsession. It was Burroughs who encouraged Ford to fill Fairlane with wildlife, to think of the estate as a sanctuary rather than merely a home. In 1916, Ford built a grotto at Fairlane in honor of his friend. Jensen designed a stone alcove overlooking a heated bird bath, with rocks shipped from the farm in upstate New York where Burroughs had been born. Burroughs himself laid the cornerstone. Edison wrote a dedication praising both men as rare souls who had not been caught in the frenzy of merciless commercialism. The camping trips grew more elaborate each year. By 1918, when all 4 vagabonds finally traveled together for the first time, the caravan included 6 vehicles with 7 drivers and support staff. They wound through the mountains of West Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia, stopping wherever the scenery pleased them. By 1919, the expedition had become a rolling circus. 50 vehicles followed the vagabonds through New York, Vermont, and New Hampshire. Ford had designed special equipment for the journey. A kitchen car carried a gasoline stove and a built-in icebox, presided over by a professional chef. Burroughs called it the Waldorf Astoria on wheels. A supply truck held tents, cots, chairs, and electric lights. A massive folding table with a Lazy Susan could seat 20 for dinner. Reporters and photographers trailed every move. The aging adventurers performed for them shamelessly. In one contest, the 71-year-old Edison kicked a cigar off a hotel mantelpiece 3 times in a row. Ford managed it once. Burroughs, 81, lost his balance and had to be caught by onlookers. Around the campfire at night, the conversations ranged from philosophy to literature to the future of the nation. What Burroughs loved most was simply being outdoors. The vagabonds, he wrote in his diary, craved direct contact with nature, They would cheerfully endure wet, cold, smoke, mosquitoes, black flies, and sleepless nights just to touch naked reality once more. John Burroughs died in March 1921 at 83. The surviving vagabonds continued their journeys, but something essential had been lost. Presidents Harding and Coolidge joined them for portions of later expeditions. The wives now came along, bringing personal maids and butlers. What had begun as an escape from civilization had become another obligation. The final expedition took place in 1924. The trips were good fun, Ford wrote in his autobiography, except that they began to attract too much attention. Edison was gone by 1931. Firestone followed in 1938. Of the original 4, only the memories remained. And at Fair Lane, the grotto where Ford had honored his friend still stands, its heated birdbath long cold, its cornerstone marking a friendship that had bloomed in the wilderness and faded with age. Chapter 9. The Dark Side. In 1918, at the height of his fame, Henry Ford bought a small weekly newspaper in Dearborn. He told reporters he wanted a publication that could speak directly to ordinary Americans, free from the influence of Wall Street and East Coast elites. What followed would become the ugliest chapter of his life. The Dearborn Independent had a circulation of 72,000 when Ford acquired it. Within a few years, that number would swell to 900,000, making it the second largest newspaper in the country. Ford achieved this reach through a simple policy. Every dealer in America was required to sell subscriptions. Every customer who bought a car received a free copy. In May 1920, the newspaper began publishing a series of articles under the headline, "The International Jew, the World's Foremost Problem." The articles blamed Jewish people for everything from the Bolshevik Revolution to the corruption of American culture. They accused Jews of controlling banks, producing immoral entertainment, and conspiring to dominate the world. Ford did not write the articles himself. That task fell to William J. Cameron, the newspaper's editor. But the ideas were Ford's. The original editor resigned in April 1920 rather than participate. He later recalled that Ford had been bringing up the Jews constantly in conversation, blaming them for almost everything. The Antisemitic campaign ran for 91 consecutive weeks. The articles were then collected and published as a 4-volume set. Translations appeared in 16 languages. The impact was devastating. Ford was one of the most respected men in America, a symbol of innovation and success. If Henry Ford said the Jews were responsible for the nation's problems, millions of readers believed him. Across the Atlantic, a young political agitator in Munich took notice. Adolf Hitler kept a life-sized portrait of Ford on the wall behind his desk. In his autobiography, Mein Kampf, published in 1925, Hitler praised Ford as the only great man in America who still maintained independence from Jewish control. Ford was the only American mentioned favorably in the entire book. In 1931, Hitler told a Detroit news reporter that he regarded Ford as his inspiration. Jewish organizations fought back. The Anti-Defamation League documented the falsehoods in Ford's publications. A boycott of Ford automobiles spread through Jewish communities. But the newspaper continued publishing. The end came through the courts. In 1924, the newspaper accused Aaron Shapiro, a Jewish attorney, of exploiting American farmers as part of a Jewish conspiracy. Shapiro sued for libel. The trial began in March 1927. Shortly before Ford was scheduled to testify, he agreed to settle. On June 30th, 1927, Ford released a public apology. He expressed regret that Jews had come to regard him as their enemy and asked their forgiveness for the harm he had unintentionally committed. The apology was actually written by Louis Marshall, president of the American Jewish Committee. Ford simply signed it. Many Jews accepted the retraction with deep skepticism. Their doubts proved justified. Copies of The International Jew continued to circulate for decades. In 1938, on Ford's 75th birthday, the German government sent him a present. It was the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, the highest honor Nazi Germany could bestow on a foreigner. The golden medal, surrounded by 4 small swastikas, was presented to Ford at his Dearborn offices. Ford accepted the award. He never returned it. At the Nuremberg trials, Baldur von Schirach, the former Hitler youth leader who had helped deport 65,000 Jews to death camps, testified about what had shaped his beliefs. The decisive anti-Semitic book, he said, was that book by Henry Ford. If Henry Ford said that Jews were to blame, why naturally we believed him. Ford lived long enough to see newsreel footage of the concentration camps. According to one close associate, he collapsed with a stroke when confronted with the images. The man who had revolutionized industry, who had built Fairlane as a sanctuary from the world, spent his final years knowing that his words had helped fuel the worst genocide in human history. Some stains cannot be washed away. Chapter 10: The Unraveling. In the years when nature flourished at Fairlane, something was rotting at the heart of Ford Motor Company. The man who controlled that rot was named Harry Bennett. A former Navy sailor and boxer, Bennett had come to Ford in 1918, and over 2 decades had made himself indispensable to Henry Ford. As head of the company's service department, Bennett commanded up to 3,000 men. Newspapers called it the largest private paramilitary organization in America. Bennett's force consisted of former convicts, washed-up boxers, and professional thugs. They patrolled the factories. They surveilled the workers. They beat down anyone who talked about unions. On May 26, 1937, the confrontation came. At Gate 4 of the Rouge plant, union leaders from the United Auto Workers had gathered on an overpass above Miller Road to hand out leaflets. Walter Reuther, Richard Frankenstein, and several others stood there with flyers reading, "Unionism, not Fordism." A photographer from the Detroit News asked them to pose with the Ford sign in the background. Then Bennett's men arrived. 40 of them stormed the overpass. They slammed Reuther against the concrete 7 times, kicked him down 2 flights of stairs. They pulled Frankenstein's jacket over his head and beat him senseless. Another organizer had his back broken. Bennett's men tried to destroy the photographer's film, but one of them managed to hide the negatives. The pictures that appeared in newspapers the next day showed America what Ford Motor Company had become. The press called it the Battle of the Overpass. General Motors and Chrysler had already signed with the Union. Ford stood alone. In April 1941, Bennett fired 8 Union members, and the workers responded with a strike. They blockaded the factory for 10 days. Henry Ford raged. He threatened to shut down the entire company rather than give in. But Clara Ford had seen enough blood and violence. She gave her husband an ultimatum. If he did not sign with the Union, she would leave him. On June 20th, 1941, Ford signed. Paradoxically, he gave the workers better terms than either General Motors or Chrysler had offered. 2 years later came the tragedy that broke Henry Ford. On May 26, 1943, Edsel Ford died of stomach cancer at his home on Lake Street, Clare. He was 49 years old. The relationship between father and son had been complicated. Henry had spent decades undermining Edsel's decisions, humiliating him publicly, and allowing Bennett to harass him. Many believed the stress had contributed to his illness. Edsel's son, Henry II, would later say that although his father died of cancer, it was his grandfather who had killed him. Despite being 80 years old and having suffered several strokes, Henry Ford resumed the presidency of the company. It was a disaster. His mental faculties were failing. He could not recognize old friends. Others made decisions in his name while the company lost $10 million a month. The Roosevelt administration discussed nationalizing Ford to secure war production. In 1945, Clara and Edsel's widow Eleanor forced him to relinquish control. They threatened to sell their stock if he refused. On September 21, 1945, grandson Henry Ford II was appointed president. He was 28 years old. His first act was to get rid of Harry Bennett. A former FBI agent named John Bugess delivered the message. Bennett and Bugess drew pistols on each other. That same afternoon, Bennett left the building, and his nearly 30-year reign of terror was over. When someone told Henry Ford what had happened, the old man sat quietly for a long time. "Well," he finally said, "now Harry is back where he started. Chapter 11, By Candlelight. On the evening of April 6, 1947, heavy rains swelled the Rouge River beyond anything Dearborn had ever seen. Water rose 2 to 4 feet higher than any flood in memory. The river that had powered Fairlane for 3 decades now turned against it. Murky floodwaters poured into the powerhouse and drowned the generators. The turbines fell silent. The 56-room mansion went dark. Henry Ford spent that final day as he had spent so many others. He was driven to Greenfield Village to survey the flood damage. He walked through the Rouge plant. He inspected his freighter, the Henry Ford II, which had just returned from its first voyage of spring. Those who saw him said he had never looked better, that he was full of his usual vitality. Before retiring for the evening, he told his aide Ray Dollinger to be ready early the next morning. There was a 50-mile tour planned: Flat Rock, Cherry Hill, other properties to inspect. The old man was still making plans. That night the mansion had no heat except for the fireplace, no light except candles and kerosene lamps. The telephone lines were down. Clara tucked heavy blankets around her husband as flickering shadows danced on the bedroom walls. Shortly before midnight, Henry told her he was not feeling well. Clara sent the chauffeur out into the storm to find a doctor. She called the maid to the bedroom. When the maid arrived, she heard Clara's voice. "Henry," she was saying, "speak to me." At 11:40 on the night of April 7, 1947, Henry Ford died of a cerebral hemorrhage. He was 83 years old. At his bedside were Clara and members of the household staff. The man who had built an empire of electricity and machines drew his last breath by firelight and candle flame, in circumstances no different from the night his mother had given birth to him on a Dearborn farm 83 years before. He left this world the same way he had entered it. The news spread quickly despite the storm. The next morning, Detroit woke to newspaper headlines that screamed a single word: Ford dead. Below it, a smaller line: dies in oil-lit, unheated home. The city came to a standstill. Gas stations closed. Buses and streetcars stopped running. Ford factories and showrooms around the world fell silent. His body was taken to Greenfield Village, to the recreation hall he had built as a monument to American ingenuity. For 2 days, mourners filed past his casket. They came at a rate of 5,000 every hour. They stood in a line that stretched more than a mile. By the time the doors closed, an estimated 100,000 people had paid their respects. It was the largest funeral in Detroit's history. On Thursday, April 10th, the funeral service was held at the Cathedral Church of St. Paul in Detroit. 600 mourners filled the pews inside. 20,000 more stood in the rain outside. Every automobile factory in America observed a moment of silence. An estimated 7 million people across the nation paused to mourn. Henry Ford was laid to rest in the Ford Cemetery in Detroit, beside his mother who had died when he was 12, and near the farmland where he had been born. The boy who had hated farm work. The young man who had walked more than 8 miles to Detroit to escape it. The inventor who had changed the world and then watched that world leave him behind. He was the last of the great triumvirate. Edison had died in 31, Firestone in 38. Now Ford was gone too. The age of the pioneers was over. Clara lived on at Fairlane for 3 more years, alone in the great house by the river. She died in 1950 and was buried beside her husband. They had been married for 62 years. Today, Fairlane still stands. The Rouge River still flows through its grounds. And on quiet evenings, when the light fades and shadows gather in the old rooms, it is not difficult to imagine a candle flickering in an upstairs window.